Hello, welcome to the first Global Dialog Webinar of 2025. I'm Liane Henschke, Executive Director of the Tennessee World Affairs Council, a nonpartisan and nonprofit organization that promotes global literacy and international awareness through the following programs. We have Webinar, Global Dialogue, and Global Nashville with Claudine. We have Distinguished Speaker Series, our in-person events, the school program named Student Leaders Without Borders, and Global Eats. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Brian Katulis, a Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy and Middle East Institute, as part of our webinar series, Global Dialogue. He will be hosted by our board member, Dr. Brett Walker. Please use the chat to ask questions to the speakers. Let me introduce the moderator of today's webinar. Dr. Brett Walker pursued a 20-year career in international business, law, and finance before turning to the academia. For several years, he taught foreign policies courses at SWANEE, the University of South, and worked as a contract historian for the Office of the Secretary of Defense Historical Office, researching and writing on early Pentagon policies in the computer security and cyber areas. He is a board member of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. I now turn it over to Dr. Brett Walker to introduce Mr. Katulis and moderate the discussion. Thank you both, as well as the participants of today's webinar. Brett.
Thank you, Leanne. Well, Brian Katulis is a senior fellow, as Leanne said, for U.S. foreign policy at the Middle East Institute. He was formerly a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he built the center's Middle East program and also worked on broader issues related to U.S. national security. He's done extensive research and produced influential studies that have shaped important discussions around regional policy in the Middle East and countries including Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories. His past experiences include work at the National Security Council and the U.S. Departments of State and Defense. Brian has a master's degree in public affairs from Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs and a Bachelor of Arts in History and Arab and Islamic Studies from Villanova. He was a Fulbright Scholar in the mid-90s. I would also mention that Brian has a regular podcast, Taking the Edge Off the Middle East, that I have in preparation for our talk here today, that I've listened to a number of them, and I found it to be very informative and thought-provoking, and you can access an archive of those podcasts on the Middle East Institute website. Brian is a very well-regarded and influential expert in the region, is here to talk with us today, of course, about the Middle East. Brian, welcome, and thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Our format today, I'm going to moderate at the start, ask a few questions for Brian in the first 30 to 40 minutes, and then open it up for audience questions. And as Leanne said, please put your questions in the chat room, and I will work them into our conversation. Okay, well, Brian, let's start, if it's okay, with your broad sense of recent U.S. policy in the Middle East. And maybe the best way to do that in summary fashion, if you wouldn't mind, is for you to give us your views on the Biden's administration approach to the Middle East, accomplishments and shortfalls as you see it.
That's a great starting point, because we're only a little over 3 weeks into the new Trump 2.0 administration, and it's always good to start from where we came from. And what I would say about the Biden team, and I wrote a series of reports, which I shared with you along the way, critically evaluating how they handled the Middle East, I'd say three main things. First, I think its main accomplishment, and it's quite modest, was to prevent the breakout of a wider regional war, particularly between Israel and Iran. And that accomplishment, I think, is a testimony not just to what the Biden team did, but for decades of U.S. policy of trying to build partnerships across the region, not just with Israel or Egypt or Jordan, countries that we give a lot of military aid to, but essentially pre-positioning our forces in key parts of the Arab world, in Doha, in Qatar, and in other places. And having that presence, but importantly, serving not as a security guarantor, but as an integrator between the different countries in the region that are threatened by various elements, whether it's terrorist groups like ISIS, or in this instance, Iran. If you recall, let's rewind the clock to 2024. There were 2 instances where Israel and Iran actually directly attacked each other, which was a very dangerous moment. When in April of last year, Iran attacked Israel with more than 350 ballistic missiles, drones, and other things, and most of those attacks were thwarted. Again, that's not a small accomplishment to attest to, like, not a regional war. It sounds like a very modest outcome, but it's very important given the energy supplies, the dependence of the global economy on that. I think that's one accomplishment. The second thing I'd say about the Biden team is that it entered office not prioritizing the Middle East. In 2021, if you recall, the priority was at home. We were still in the COVID pandemic and an economic meltdown because of the automatic shutdown, forced shutdown of the US economy. So much of the focus, I recall, in those early months of the first Biden administration was, let's not do the thing that previous administrations did, which is overinvest in the Middle East, do too much, go to wars that end up being 2 decades long. So they really, when on the international agenda, quite clearly in that first year, they were focused more on China, climate change, rebuilding partnerships with key countries in Europe and Asia. But as I like to say, the Biden team had its Michael Corleone moment on the Middle East. Every US president has it. Michael Corleone, the main character in Godfather 3, he said, just when I thought it was out, I get pulled back in. And every US president has had it, had that moment where we think we can actually pull away from it. Barack Obama tried to do this by, quote unquote, ending the war in Iraq in 2011, pulling all the US troops out. And then 2 years later, we're back in because of the ISIS crisis. So the second thing I'd say about the Biden team, after its main accomplishment was preventing all-out war, was it came in with very modest goals, but events forced their hand and forced them to deepen its engagement. The third thing I'd say about the Biden approach was there's a real breakpoint between pre-October 7th, 2023 and post-October 7th, 2023. And on this third point, what I'd say is that as the Biden team in 2022 and early 2023 was gradually increasing US engagement, they sent President Biden to Israel and Saudi Arabia in the summer of 2022, largely in reaction to the run-up in oil prices and gas prices. Russia invaded Ukraine. They sensed that we need to stabilize our relationships with key countries, including Saudi Arabia. So that pre-10/7 moment was about trying to do things, building relationships, fostering an Israel-Saudi normalization accord, which never came to pass, and a number of things. And then October 7th hit. And on this third point, the Biden team, and I'll close here, essentially saw themselves drawn in a way that was largely a reactive, tactical crisis management posture. One that actually, again, the main accomplishment, it prevented a bigger war that did not draw in wider regional powers, but it was a deadly period. And it took a long time to get to ceasefires between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, and Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, but they doggedly stuck to the case, and those ceasefires still to this day very tenuously hold. You know, it's very fragile, but it's, again, in a region like the Middle East, sometimes that's the best you can hope for, is that the outcome wasn't as bad as it could have been.
Well, great. Well, now with that in mind, I'd like to take, before we drill down to some of these specific topics, I'd like to take another broad view of what the future in the Middle East looks like in the near term, anyway, because it's been such an eventful 16 months or so with, as you alluded to, with the horrific attack on Israel by Hamas, the devastating Israeli response and the decimation of Hamas, the conflict with Hezbollah and Israel in the north, the subsequent ceasefire arranged in November, and the overall intimidation, I guess I would call it, of Hezbollah the state-on-state attacks you referenced by Iran on Israel and Israel on Iran, and Israel's military response greatly, by all accounts, greatly weakened Iran's air defenses and perhaps missile and drone production. As a result, the overall reduction of Iran's influence in the region, and of course, the sudden and unexpected regime change in Syria. This series of unexpected black swans, and as well, we have a new American president now with very different ideas on the Middle East from all of his predecessors, perhaps. So from an American perspective, what opportunities and risk have arisen in the Middle East as a result of these events that weren't there a couple of years ago?
Yeah, that was a perfect picture of what you painted strategically across the region. After more than a year and a half of turmoil, essentially, or almost a year and a half, we're still at a very tenuous moment. I think I'd like to start with opportunities, because I like to start with the positive. And I talked more about this pre-October 7th, but I still think it's an enduring feature. The big opportunity is one in which the region actually becomes much more integrated with itself and with the rest of the world when it comes to the economic and energy and practical day-to-day needs of the people. And there's an opportunity there, borne out in part because of the successive peace agreements, some going back a long time ago, the Israel-Egypt one that's almost 50 years old, the one between Israel and Jordan, and then more recently, the 2020 Abraham Accords. I just came back last week from Abu Dhabi and Oman, spent a lot of time with top leaders. And despite all of this turmoil of the last year and a half or so, this silver linings playbook, this sense that very wealthy, oil-rich Gulf states, which have had a lot of wealth for decades, but in the last decade, they've been doing something differently, which is trying to diversify their economic models and move beyond the heavy dependence on oil and fossil fuels, though they're still quite dependent on that. They have huge sovereign wealth funds. They're looking for new models for investment and actually integration within their region of the world, from Israel to the Gulf, inclusive of Turkey and North Africa. But then, interestingly, which I witnessed when I was in Abu Dhabi earlier this month, the role that India plays, China wants to play. In essence, if you look at the Middle East, for decades, I think in our minds here in America, we understandably think of it as just this region of chaos that has caused problems and exported terrorism, bad ideas, oil, other things to the rest of the world. But other parts of the world and the region itself, leaders in the region itself, see itself as a connector between the engines of the global economy, and really connecting Asia with Africa, and trying to play that not just transit role, but add value. And I do think that there's a lot to work with there. When you look at what's unfolding in Riyadh, in Abu Dhabi, in Muscat, Oman, and Qatar as well. There's a new style of thinking that is unlike on economic affairs, but also on social and religious affairs, that I think is transformative. So that's the main silver linings playbook, and I think it's very encouraging. Add to it some of the things you said as well. The Iranian regime is on its back heels right now. It's lost many of its proxies. It's down, but it's not out, which would lead me to sort of the main risk that I see that out there right now. There's several of them, but one is that this fragile balance that exists across the region. The Houthis in Yemen, which had been attacking shipping, international commerce in the Red Sea for much of the last year, they're quieter right now. Hezbollah has been hit hard in Lebanon. They're down, but they're not out. The Assad regime is gone in Syria, but the situation by no means in Syria is clear, and no one knows what the future holds. There's a new leader, there's a new pathway to a new government, but two of my colleagues, Charles Lister and former US Ambassador Robert Ford, just came back from trips to Syria, and we heard from them earlier today at the Middle East Institute. And it's a situation that requires a lot of time, attention, and investment if we don't want things like ISIS to come back, if we don't want to see the risk of civil wars that we saw in Syria, in Yemen, and Libya reemerge. So the real risk here is one of a fragile stability that collapses. It could collapse in an instant right now in these ceasefires between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, or the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. These are not lock, stock, secure peace agreements between two state entities. And the equilibrium is still a bit off. And then the bigger risk, and I'll close here, is whether Iran, which remains the biggest strategic conundrum for the United States and for the rest of the world, whether it rushes headlong to get a nuclear weapon. It's closer than it ever has been. Here in America, we like to point fingers and blame, do the partisan thing. I don't do that much. I just try to assess clinically. And my assessment is that successive US administrations have fallen short, whether Republican or Democrat, in trying to achieve greater progress towards the goal of making sure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon, because if it does, not only is it a dangerous regime, it could lead to a cascading effect throughout the region in which other countries actually move in that direction in a broader non-proliferation environment that is essentially collapsing and in meltdown.
Okay, well, with that, and thank you for that. With that as background, I'd like to move, I guess, from the general to the specific and talk about Gaza first. Of course, a ceasefire and hostage agreement was negotiated in mid-January between Israel and Hamas with much U.S. assistance. But so could you sort of give us a summary of what's happened in the last month and where we are today with regard to that agreement and whether it's going to hold in your mind and so forth?
Yeah, so to go back to it, this is a deal that essentially is a three-phase deal that was brokered after more than a year of diplomacy, involving not only the U.S., but Egypt and Qatar are key interlocutors here, because the United States does not deal with the terrorist organization Hamas. So we work through them in various channels to get to agreements. The essence of the three-phase deal, the first part, is what we've seen unfolding, if you follow the news. A series of hostage releases, Israelis mostly, but also some foreign nationals, including Americans, which the terrorist group Hamas has been holding for more than a year, in exchange for the release of a far larger number of Palestinian prisoners that have been in Israeli detention for a longer period of time. In addition to, another component of it is the lifting of some of the strictures that were on the aid going in to Gaza. So I've talked to some of my friends. I used to work and live in Gaza. I talked to them. There's more food coming in. There's still shortage of tents, a slowness in some of the material getting in. So along the way in this first phase, which again, this three-phase deal, if it goes to the end, the original it was envisioned to actually unfold over the next 4 or 5 months. Second phase, first phase involves some repositioning of Israeli troops that are inside of Gaza, but the second phase is the one that I think is going to be the trickiest to get to, because it requires concessions on the part of both Hamas and Israel, that even when crafting this deal, they said that they could get to it, but they need to discuss some of the details, which are particularities about what would be the force posture and presence of Israeli forces. Israel, quite understandably, is concerned about its own security after suffering such a grievous attack on October 7th. So it's worried about being able to position and have buffer zones and safe zones for itself and its citizens. There's some debate over that. There's debate over the access of parts of the Gaza Strip. And that's the plan that's in place right now. And the third phase would lead to sort of the wider visions that some people have for a pathway to a two-state solution and normalization and things like this. But in essence, the core of it is two parties that see themselves in an existential fight with each other, Israel and Hamas, not really trusting each other and having much confidence, testing the limits, as we saw the last couple of days, where Hamas was saying there wasn't enough material getting in as was promised in terms of rebuilding and where people can live, and then threatening to pause the release of hostage releases. Israel, like many, including myself, shocked at the images of hostages that were released this past weekend, who were very thin and not in good health. And it leaves worries and concerns. So you may have seen in the news, President Trump threatening that he might encourage Israel to end the ceasefire if there is a delay in the hostage release. It seems like that crisis has passed for now, because it's not these public statements that matter, in my view, as much as the private channels, the work that's done quietly by diplomats, intel professionals, others, but diplomats in the region as well, to essentially let cooler heads prevail, essentially tell the parties that you have more to actually stay in these agreements rather than return to a war that's killed tens of thousands of people and caused all sorts of chaos. So that's where we're at. I wouldn't bet a lot of money on the whole deal moving forward. And then I'm sure you're going to ask about President Trump's more recent statements about the status of the Gaza Strip in the longer run. I think that also serves as a distraction and moves things away from the potential that this particular ceasefire will go to fruition and achieve sort of the stated goals of essentially separation between the Israelis and Palestinians, and then some sort of pathway to rebuild of Gaza.
Well, and I would like to just go into that a little bit further, if it's okay. I mean, as you said, President Trump has floated this idea of that is not very clear in its details, but has floated this idea that the U.S. in some sense may come in and redevelop Gaza, whatever that means. And while that's happening, and maybe after it happens, if it ever happens, that he's looking, and Egypt and Jordan have particularly been in the news, to accept Palestinian refugees from Gaza, to resettle them perhaps on some sort of permanent basis. He's at least flirted with that idea. And of course, the estimates I've seen are 2 million Palestinian refugees and that would come out of Gaza that would have that kind of status. Anyway, one is this a viable idea or solution in your view? I know it's gotten a lot of derision from most foreign countries and all Middle Eastern countries, but is this a viable solution? And then secondly, if it's not, and you were advising Trump as his right-hand Middle Eastern expert, what objectives would you tell him the United States should have, and what role should we play in Gaza in looking out over the next several months or even years?
Yeah, those are great questions. So on the first question, I think the answer basically is no, it's not viable. Even people on Trump's own team admit this privately. In some cases, if you look carefully at parse words with public statements. Michael Waltz, Trump's national security advisor, when asked about it, essentially said that President Trump is just trying to get others to draw them out, including Arab nations, to outline their plans that they would do in the alternative. The reason why it's not viable is for the main reason that you said. It's been roundly rejected in the Middle East. Whatever happens with the Palestinians, I think it's pretty clear that U.S. taxpayers are not going to actually fund and underwrite the reconstruction or the forcible removal of them, nor will Israelis. So do the math. Where's it going to come from? Probably a lot of these oil-rich Arab Gulf countries, who, by the way, over the last year, in all of my work and travels and research, including this past week, are still quite willing to sign up to a credible plan for a pathway to resolve that situation. In their view, what does that credible plan, to answer the second part of your question, look like? It doesn't look anything like what President Trump is talking about. And let me be more explicit than you were. What President Trump is actually saying is that the United States would just take that land. This is just quoting him. I'm not making things up. He didn't worry about the niceties of legalities. He didn't actually think through the fact that there are still 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza, most of whom don't want to go. They're not refugees. Some of them are from what used to be the land that they lived in, which was Israel. But a lot of them don't want to go, right? So that's one practical problem. The other practical problem is that Hamas, though down, it's not out. As we see in the images of these hostage releases, they still have a lot of weapons. And essentially what this war has produced, one thing it's produced is a Mogadishu on the Mediterranean. Mogadishu being the capital of Somalia, that was quite chaotic in the early 1990s. So before we even get to questions about whether other countries would take them, the viability of whether people, A, would leave, B, there could be a safe transport for them, is just not possible right now, because the security situation is one in which there's no fundamental law and order. There's criminal gangs and terrorist groups that rule the streets. Why I say Mogadishu on the Mediterranean. So it's pretty impractical there. What's the likely alternative? And I think it's something similar to what we've heard from many of the Arab states. We heard from Egypt recently. We'll hear more from them shortly. And they want to actually keep Palestinians in Gaza. You'll have to move them around because of the devastation, but they've moved around 3 or 4 times, some of them even more. And then have some sort of investment that comes mostly from Arab Gulf states that rebuilds the homes and the infrastructure. This is a tens of billions of dollars venture. This will take many, many years. This will outlast the Trump administration, given the devastation that Palestinians have experienced. That seems more practical than the forcible transfer of Palestinians from Gaza. There's also some concerns about statements Trump has made about the millions of Palestinians, about the status of the West Bank, and whether hinting at maybe he'll allow the annexation of the West Bank by Israel, which is disputed territory, and there's millions of Palestinians who live there as well. So all of these things, I think, I'll close here on your question, is there's two different interpretations of what Trump is doing here in making the statement. One is the more generous one, and it's the one that people on his team are saying. It's like he's saying basically, okay, nothing else has worked in the past, and Arab states in particular talk a good game, but they don't deliver. So let them come up with their plan. We'll see. End of this month, Egypt is hosting a summit. We'll see what sort of plan they have. They have some plans in the works, and I think it'll be quite interesting. The second sort of alternative analysis is that President Trump actually does not want to go anywhere close to the old notions of a two-state solution, that he's very much bought into some of the ideas that you see on the Israeli right. Jordan is Palestine was a slogan of the Likud party in the late 1970s, right? And many Jordanians, including King Abdullah, object to that. And the other theory of the case is that he's essentially saying, look, even though it's against international law, I don't care. These people have to go. Other people have to accept them. But the problem with that, even if that's his way of thinking, is you've got people that don't want to leave, and then you also have countries that won't accept them. So that's why I think it's not viable.
Thank you. Okay, well, moving on to Syria then. In December, of course, the Assad regime was overthrown by opposition forces. Could you give us a brief summary of why that happened in such a sudden and unexpected way, and talk a little bit about, at least in terms of the big picture, what the likely future for Syria is in your view?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, and you should check out their work, Charles Lister and Robert Ford, former ambassador to Syria, they've done tremendous work based on their time on the ground recently. And Ford was the ambassador when the Arab uprisings began. He was in Damascus back in 2011. Why did this happen so quickly? So in essence, Syria, though we've largely had it out of sight, out of mind for many years over the last 5-7 years, the civil war continued. It endured. You had a very unpopular regime in the Assad regime that essentially had killed hundreds of thousands of its own people. And as we've seen in the images, devastating images of people freed from prison and then people lost and disappeared in their prison system. They ruled with a brutal repression. But Syria had become, under his rule and during the civil war, increasingly isolated and economically isolated as well. And at the core of it, you had a crumbling infrastructure in the Assad regime inside the country. You had neighboring countries like Turkey to Syria's north, which adopted a different posture and was offering support to some of these opposition forces that swept very rapidly and took control and surprised everybody. But in essence, you had very organized groups that were biding their time. And the key thing that had changed for the Assad regime was that the regional and international support networks that had existed that helped them maintain their position of power inside of Syria during 2011 to 2015, 2016, the support that Iran provided, Hezbollah next door in Lebanon, Russia, importantly, coming in. All of these parties essentially were distracted, or in the case of Hezbollah, were facing devastating losses themselves in a war with Israel. So the multiplicity of these factors, the internal weakness of the Assad regime, combined with its loss of its international support network, or the weakening of it, combined with some regional countries saying, maybe we should do something different here, including Turkey, actually led to this dramatic shift. It's a dramatic shift that is, to this day, very inconclusive. Like, it's heartwarming to me to see the images and then to talk to Syrian people who have not really tasted any semblance of freedom all of their lives, and to see that unfold. But at the same time, as someone like me who went into Iraq in 2003 as a researcher and saw similar images and experienced it from Iraqis, without any long-term plan for law and order and economic stability, this could become a combustible mess. And right now, things are still pretty quiet. Early on in this transition, if you recall, the Biden team actually did two important things. One, the US military, our counterterrorism forces, actually struck at ISIS because they're still there and they're still present, and there were many attacks against different threats. Similarly, on the security front, there were quiet efforts that people will write about maybe quite soon to secure the chemical weapons arsenals, because those are very dangerous weapons. You don't want to see them spreading around or threatening neighbors. The other thing the Biden team did was set up an engagement framework with the new powers that be. Ahmed Ashara, the new president, former leader of essentially terrorist groups, groups that were aligned with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And that should give us all cause for concern. Do leopards change their spots? We'll see. But what the Biden team set up was an engagement framework that said we could possibly provide some sort of support, recognition, and other things if these parties that want to rule Syria do X, Y, and Z. Where we are right now is really unclear. We're 3 weeks into the Trump administration. President Trump has named as his nominee for the Assistant Secretary of State in the Middle East, the top diplomat for the Middle East, the person that would replace Barbara Leaf, the woman I interviewed in my last podcast, Joel Rayburn, who is a credible individual who has had a lot of experience on Syria. He worked in the first Trump administration on Syrian issues. It's a real open question, though, with things like what's going on with the freeze and aid, the gutting and cutting of USAID, Doge and Elon Musk's impending plans for the State Department and other things, whether we're essentially unilaterally disarming ourselves to shape and influence events and outcomes in Syria. Still too soon to tell. The worries that I hear from people who are on the front lines in these camps in northeast Syria, where ISIS detainees and their families are held, is that this uncertainty about America's military presence, its willingness to deliver foreign aid support to contractors and others that actually contain this crisis, that's producing a lot of uncertainty on the ground. Bigger issues Syria faces are whether they can deal with justice and accountability for all the crimes the Assad regime committed in an organized way, rather than in a way that leads to retribution and further violence and divisions. But so far, so good. You know, we're essentially 2 months plus into the change in this administration. It could have been more chaotic, but they're not out of the woods yet.
Well, President, just to stay on Syria for a minute, President Trump has suggested that that he wants to remove all U.S. troops in that area, and along with Vice President Vance, I don't think he's taken this back, has said, they both say we need to stay uninvolved in that. It's not our fight, and so forth. In your view, should the United States try to play a role in shaping the outcome in Syria that's in our interest and presumably in the interest of the Syrian people, or not? Is non-involvement the way to? We don't have the greatest track record in the whole world about being involved. So, what should the U.S. do here?
Yeah, I think it's not a dichotomous choice. It's not a either or, meaning we often present it as such, involve or disengage. And the reality is when we actually find pathways, and this is what I would say the right formula is the United States has these longstanding relationships, not with Syria right now, because we actually haven't been there for a while, but with neighbors of Syria, including Jordan, including now Iraq. I've met with Iraqis recently. This is their neighborhood. We shouldn't be on the front lines. We certainly shouldn't be policing the place. I'm not a military expert, but many who tell me, including Joe Votel, Frank McKenzie, my colleagues at the Middle East Institute, who are former generals, they essentially say it's better for us to have some limited presence if it's not that costly, but their role being mostly that we're enabling local forces to keep a grip on the terrorism problems and the regional security challenges. And to me, that's why I say it's not an either or. I would prefer to see some sort of pathway where the United States is working by, with, and through regional actors, getting our partners to actually pull their weight, share the burden. We're not the ones who are out there. It's essentially not far off from where we've been at in Syria and Iraq right now. It's not like we've had a lot of deaths and issues inside of Syria. It certainly doesn't look like early Iraq 2003 to 2008, right? We did have this tragic incident about a year ago where Iranian-backed militias killed three U.S. soldiers in a base in Jordan, but they attacked them from Syria. So those things, I think, are unfortunate, but they're not on the scale of the devastation that we saw for most of the years in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think there's a balanced midway approach, and it mostly goes through leaning on those partners and demanding that they actually do more. The challenge here is, I think, the tone of certain proposals, and again, it's still too early to tell with President Trump, but it does not, his approach does not instill the trust and confidence that you need to actually work by, with, and through those partners. If anything, I think his modus vivendi, it does get results, is to set people off balance with unexpected statements or moves or threats to cut aid and things like this. But what I saw as this was playing out in the first couple of weeks in this new administration, when I was in some of the key power centers in the Middle East, it didn't lead to this shock and awe, like, we better listen to this guy. It was a little bit more like, well, maybe we'll hedge a bit more away from the United States and work with China or India, or we'll make our own pathways. And in that sense, then America may have less influence to shape those outcomes. And those outcomes may not be what we're looking for when it comes to keeping Americans safe from terrorism, keeping the region safe from a wider turmoil. So I'd adopt sort of a middle path there, if that's clear, right? It's not all us. We don't have to do it all, but we have to build these partnerships where we are investing some. That minimal investment will pay off dividends in the long run and will hopefully make the region more stable.
Okay, well, thanks. That's very helpful. Now, I'd like to move on to Iran, just hitting all the hot spots, so to speak.
Sure.
And as we talked about it, Iran's seen its proxies weakened, its own military capabilities weakened. Some of the Iranian leaders have said that they think that they face an existential crisis from threats from Israel and or the United States. How do you think the Iranian leadership views its position today when they're in their councils talking about what their fears are and so forth? What's going on in the Iranian mind?
I think they see themselves first and foremost staring down the barrel of a transition. Their supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is quite old and not in good health. So, like a lot of these regimes, including the one in Tehran, which came to power through a revolution and has ruled with a brutal iron fist, it is worried first and foremost about its own internal stability. And that's why successive attacks, including the ones that Israel conducted last year in retaliation and reaction to what Iran did, but then a series of attacks against nuclear scientists and things like this, worries about infiltration. And they worry quite often that it's Israel or the United States. Sometimes it's just, as we saw in an attack last year, terrorist groups that don't like Iran from the region. So regime stability is item number one. Their approach for decades has been this forward defense effort to create this network, essentially of terrorist groups, non-state actors, and others that they want to keep Israel and the United States on their back foot. Now, Israel mostly has restored a sense of strategic deterrence a year plus after October 7th. So I think they're worried. And the key question is whether they want to talk with their neighbors and talk with other countries, including the United States, or whether they want to make a drive towards a nuclear weapon and pursue the North Korea route. And I heard very mixed messages. I met some people from Tehran when I was in Abu Dhabi last week, and then I talked to Omanis, who are one of America's key interlocutors with Tehran. And in Oman, the message was, we want to talk, right? And Trump, I'm sure, is hearing this through various signals. There have been reports that his advisor, Elon Musk, had met with some people from the UN mission, the Iranian mission at the UN, to talk about some issues. Not sure about all of this, but I do think the regime in Tehran is divided. There are factions that do want to reach out and have a discussion. The question is whether that discussion is just simply to buy time and not change fundamentally how they've operated around the region and with their nuclear program. There are others that really feel and fear that what Israel did in October to strike out and take out their air defense systems inside of Iran, it could produce a pathway to even more strikes at some point. Some argue that they should rush to get a bomb. So I think it's divided. So the two main, I think, attitudes inside of the regime right now, to answer your question, are A, concerned about their future, about the stability of their own country, and whether the regime can hold on to power, because it's deeply unpopular, as we've seen at home with protests. And then second, feeling a bit encircled and trying to figure out whether diplomatic talks with the region, perhaps with the United States and others, is the right pathway, or is it to double down on a nuclear program?
Okay, and I think this is one of his latest statements, but President Trump had said, I think recently, that with regard to Iran, he would rather reach some verifiable nuclear agreement, which seems like a little bit of a different perspective than he had his first term, but he would prefer to reach a verifiable nuclear agreement over, quote, bombing the hell out of them. From a U.S. perspective, again, if you were Trump's advisor, what's the right approach in your mind for the U.S. to take at this point?
So I actually think it's not that different from his first term in actual sort of endpoint. If you look at Trump's actions, and he's quite reticent to use military force. He was also, even when we've been attacked by Iran in the region, there's one instance that was quite dramatic and stirring in January of 2022, when he conducted a strike against Qasem Soleimani and others, Qasem Soleimani being the leader of the Iranian Quds Force, which was responsible for terror and death of U.S. soldiers across the region. But by and large, Trump was very reticent. He had a label and a policy of maximum pressure that was mostly trying to isolate Iran economically with sanctions, and pretty hard sanctions. But the reality in the region was that Iran was moving forward with doubling down on its proxies. It actually, in many ways, got stronger. I think the fact that Hamas conducted its attack in October of 2023 and they did so after building for years during Trump's maximum pressure, and it's a proxy of Iran, these networks of tunnels and arms shipments, many of which come from Iran as well. So he, in some ways, I think, wasn't as hawkish as he sounds to a lot of people when it comes to military force. I think he does want a deal. Look, he sat down with, remember, let's not confuse sort of the statements with what he actually does. Remember Fire and Fury in the first term and talking about North Korea?
No,
and
good
then
point.
He sat down two times, and then also developed what seems to be a very brotherly pen pal relationship with the leader of North Korea. But the question analysts should ask then is, on that file, North Korea, what did that actually produce? It didn't get results. North Korea actually has more nuclear weapons now and is more dangerous and more means for delivering them. So I'm always good and happy for there to be engagement. I'm a very diplomatic person, but I also want results. And Trump, separating the signal from the noise is really a key part of the task analysts need to do here. I think he probably strongly inclines in his second term towards trying to find a deal. And as I wrote with Alex Vitanka and Patricia Karam in a recent report called Beyond Maximum Pressure, U.S. should actually have that conversation with Iran, but it's important for the U.S. to have that conversation with our partners, with and through our partners, Saudi Arabia, UAE, include Israel in that mix. This is their neighborhood of the world. So the framework of P5+1, which was an international framework that we used to get to nuclear talks and a nuclear deal with Iran in 2015, it's no longer relevant right now, right? Relations with China and Russia are very frayed. So I'd seek that regional pathway to have that discussion. I would still maintain a strong defensive posture against the threats that Iran poses. I wouldn't pull away, right? And the last thing I'd say is some of the signals that have been sent by Trump's own actions, and I don't mean this in any political or partisan way, but I heard this from individuals from Tehran last week. They were misreading steps that Trump has taken in his first weeks in office in this way. They said, okay, well, Trump has eliminated the security for John Bolton, his former national security advisor, Mike Pompeo, his former secretary of state, Brian Hook, a friend of mine who was his former Iran envoy. People close to the regime were essentially saying, oh, this means Trump is sorry for the things he did to us in the strike on Qasem Soleimani. This means he wants accommodation. He doesn't mind leaving his former team members vulnerable to the threats that we posed. And I said, I don't think that's what that means. But it was interesting that that's how they were interpreting these signals, that a lot of the things Trump does, people, I think, misread or overinterpret in the wrong way. And in this instance, by some in Tehran, it was viewed as, oh, he definitely wants to talk with us. He's sorry for all of, not all of the things, but the things that he's done. And that's where I think it gets really complicated with that country, Iran.
Well, Brian, I want to work in some of the questions that are coming through the chat room, if that's okay.
Sure.
And since we're talking about Trump, let me start with a couple of those. Has Trump, in your mind, and you've alluded to this a little bit here and there and said, I think, yes, with a couple of positions, but has Trump appointed a strong team to advise and represent him on Middle Eastern affairs?
So there are capable and experienced individuals, and I know many of them. I can go through the list. The top ones that matter the most are Michael Waltz and Marco Rubio, his national security advisor and his secretary of state. And they are cut from the cloth of a traditional sort of conservative internationalist point of view. But they've adapted their positions for whatever you want to call it, Trumpism, MAGA. So they'll voice whatever the boss wants. There are other people on the team. Tulsi Gabbard, who just became the director of national intelligence, she sort of raised eyebrows just because she is not from those traditional international circles. At times, as you saw in her confirmation hearings, some concerns about her voicing some things that may be close to Russia, her trip to see Assad in Syria. So that's some concerns. He's got an interesting crew, and some of them quite good, in the Middle East peace envoy spot. Steve Witkoff is a business guy, so not a policy person. But as we see, he produced a result in helping broker this release of a prisoner from Russia. Saudi Arabia, following this closely, actually played a role in that. And I don't know if you've seen the breaking news. President Trump broke this news yesterday accidentally. He said that he and Vladimir Putin may be meeting quite soon, and they may be meeting in Saudi Arabia. So this morning I checked this with friends in Riyadh and then friends on Trump's team, and they said, oh, yes, that's interesting. So yeah, and there's a guy named Eric Treger at the National Security Council who is well known. So the thing I'd say about the staffers, and I'm sorry, I'm about to get an introduction, so I'll close on this question. You can ask your an interruption here that I can't avoid, but I'll just pause for a second to mute, and I'll come right back. But I can hear your question. Yeah, sorry.
For those listening, please, again, feel free to send questions to the chat room if you have some.
Sorry, that was unprofessional. I'm doing these interviews from my home office, and we have some our telephone line has had some problems, so they came early.
No worries at all. Don't give it a thought. Well, another question we have from the audience: Trump's appointment of Huckabee as ambassador to Israel, and then I guess his recent reversal of Biden's sanctions on those Israeli settlers in the West Bank who have had, I guess, violent predilections towards Palestinians in the area and so forth. What does that say about, what do those actions have to say about Trump's view of the Palestinian cause, and as well as view on the traditional U.S. support for a two-state solution?
So I think with Huckabee and the ending of these sanctions, and to be clear what those sanctions were quite modest measures to try to impose some cost on Israeli settlers who were found and verified to have conducted acts of violence or been behind that. The Biden team, it took them a while to actually craft that. They didn't use those tools in a big way. But the fact that I would add Mike Huckabee, to Mike Huckabee, I'd add Elise Stefanik as the ambassador to the UN, who has a pretty, strongly, and I would characterize it as very conservative pro-Israel, because I think there are moderate pro-Israel types, there's even liberal pro-Israel types. All of this adds up to a package that, when I was trying to describe what are the two scenarios of what Trump's doing with this Gaza plan, it may imply that he is not strongly in favor of a two-state solution. It certainly does not indicate that he has much concern about the Palestinian people. And if you look at his record in the first term as well, he had a policy of not only maximum pressure on Iran, he also had a policy of maximum pressure on the Palestinian Authority and its leadership. It cut aid to the Palestinians. It did a number of different things. I would add to the list things like the measures against UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Agency that provides a lot of the essential aid to Gaza, people in Gaza. All of this amounts to, and again, I want to stress, I think this is too early to conclude, because it's 3 weeks into an administration with a president who prides himself on his unpredictability and his ability to turn on a dime. But it implies a package that he's not fully on board with the two-state solution, and the creation of a Palestinian state as part of that. Why that might hamper him in his wider goals is this. I think in his widest aspirations, he'd love to see an Israel-Saudi normalization accord in the region. They tried really hard to get Saudi Arabia in the Abraham Accords in 2020. I know from the foreign minister and in Saudi Arabia and others, I heard directly from him of how desperate the Trump team was to do that. Saudi Arabia is much more cautious about this. And they've been clear, as I think we're here in the next couple of weeks, about their red lines, that this is not going to happen with the current complexion of the Israeli government that we have, that denies the existence of Palestinians, at least some of the ministers do, and want to see some of them pushed out. The math just simply does not add up. So that's why I think if Trump is leaning in the Huckabee appointment and what Stefanik, the ambassador at the UN, and these measures that really don't do much to bolster and support the Palestinian people and produce a pathway to a two-state solution, he's actually impeding his own goals of trying to get that wider, bigger deal. Because almost for certain, I don't know if you've been following inside of Saudi Arabia, but there's been a decidedly shift in tone towards this notion of an Israel's normalization accord. The Financial Times, I'm glad, finally reported on this shift in tone towards Netanyahu amongst the Saudi media elite. Very, very, very strongly critical of him, in part because of jokes and statements that he made about, well, now maybe the Saudis can take Palestinians. This is a huge red line. And if I were on Trump's team, you didn't ask me on this question, but if I were on his team, I would advise him to walk back from those comments, or just stop making those comments, and try to build some sort of support network, if not from the US, I don't think it's going to come from the US, a support network to boost up the moderate Palestinians, the millions of them there. I know a lot of them who want to live in dignity and want to live side by side, and not do things that actually inflame the situation, which I fear he's going down that pathway.
Well, I guess there are a few commentators out there who I guess are somewhat optimistic about the Trump administration in the Middle East, because he and perhaps his team are so open to unconventional solutions, untraditional solutions in any case, particularly on the Palestinian issue. But we have one question: is, given the current situation in the region that you've talked about, and given the Trump administration's probable directions, are you optimistic or pessimistic about general improvement in the Middle East from, I guess, a diplomatic and peace perspective over the next 4 years, or are you a little bit more on the pessimistic side?
I have to say the United States is an important factor, but it's not the main factor. So the question is keyed off of, and the key and variable in your question is Trump. And we matter. I think we matter a lot. I believe that we should engage in a steady, regular process. But the other thing that matters even more so are the leaders and people of the region. Mm-hmm. And I do think I incline a little bit more towards the optimistic though it'll be a very bumpy road over the next couple of years. And I'm not saying that what we say doesn't matter. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's how do we modulate towards that middle path? How do we actually play a role where it's not all about us, as we were talking about on Syria, Breck, but that we're part of a key part of the team, but we're not running all the plays. Sorry, I'm a Philadelphia Eagles fan, and I still have Super Bowl on my brain. I actually think America would do well to play a quarterback role here, meaning we're not blocking and tackling and doing the tough work. We're not running up the field, though sometimes the quarterback does. We're actually assembling the team to call some plays and unifying that team. And in that way, I'm optimistic in part because the region itself sees incentives to move beyond this phase of war. Like, it's gone through very awful phases like the ISIS fight and other things. And I think even with Iran, there are new conversations that are happening across the Gulf that I've never heard of before between Saudis and Iranians. There's potential for Israel to expand its relations with so many others if it sort of adopts a different approach. And that's a big if on the Palestinian front. But with the US, going back to my football analogy, in Trump, I don't see a guy who's very willing to sort of unify a team and to call plays. He mostly sort of wants to kick the ball or do things himself or get others to do. And it's a bit confused. And what I would see in the early returns in the first 2 weeks when I was out there, in the first 2 weeks of the Trump administration, the attitude was not impolite or dismissive publicly of Trump's statements, even though there was opposition to it. It was, well, that doesn't really make sense for us right now. And it's not going to make any sense because those people are staying in Gaza. They're not coming to Jordan or Egypt or other places. So we'll sort of work around them in some sort of way. And it doesn't mean that they'll cut ties angrily with the US or do things at odds. It'll be subtle. So if, for example, maximum pressure on Iran is implemented, but it's not a military thing, I think you're going to get maximum hedging, people just hedging their bets in the region, countries hedging their bets in the region and looking to others, India, China in particular, Russia, just any semblance of strategic uncertainty coming from the US and this sort of mode of operating. Yes, I understand the argument that it can get results, but I don't think it builds the trust and confidence that's needed for America to be part of those scenarios that produce sort of big wins. It can get sort of short-term things where the king of Jordan essentially says, well, we're going to bring in 2,000 children who have cancer from Gaza. Great, really wonderful that they're doing that. But that actually isn't, the bigger ask should have been, how many troops are you willing to put on the streets of northern Gaza to help secure it so that gangs and terrorists aren't there, right? And sometimes I worry that this sort of unpredictable style of negotiating that prides itself on, like, we're going to get these big deals, quite often comes up with something that's quite paltry and less than meets the eye.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I'd like to sneak in one more audience question, if you don't mind, however brief the answer might be, please. Yeah. But the question is, of course, about Netanyahu. And I guess he's tied up and being motivated by a lot of political issues in Israel, in his own, perhaps, survival through Israeli courts and so forth and so on. But what are these political issues driving him towards in terms of objectives towards Gaza and, for that matter, the West Bank? And whatever those objectives are that he's being driven to, do they coincide, do you think, with predominant Israeli public opinion? And
that's a great question.
That's it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll try to tackle it in a minute. It's a really detailed and important question. Look, I think a general assessment of Netanyahu as a leader, and this goes for a lot of political leaders, but his primary concern is the survival of his own political life. And he's done a lot of things to shift. And Israeli coalition politics is extremely complicated, but he's been able to navigate that better than anyone else over many different phases in different years. He's the man who actually was leader on October 7th, the most devastating attack that Israel has ever faced. And there have been no political consequences for him now. Many people predicted, including me, that he'd suffer the same fate as Golda Meir after the 1973 war, which was the loss of political office for all of this. So I think what drives him at his core is survival, political survival. Some on his team would say he has these grander visions of connecting Israel to the wider world, which he has with India, with China, with the United States. It's still quite strong. But the big block on his aspiration, similar to Trump, of integration with Saudi Arabia and the wider region is himself and the views that he holds that holds him back from actually producing some sort of credible formula on the Palestinian front. And I think that's unfortunate. I think his historical legacy will be tarnished by that, plus sort of the weakness on October 7th and what he was unable to do to keep his people safe. Does he reflect Israeli opinion? I'm not being sarcastic here. Does Donald Trump reflect American opinion? Both countries are very divided, right? Even though Trump won an outright majority, Netanyahu similarly, I think, faces very strong, organized, vociferous opposition. And we saw that before October 7th in the moves that he was making against Israel's political system. You saw people protesting every week against the concerns, about the concerns they had of what Bibi was doing to the checks and balances in their Israeli political system. So, we're not here to talk about U.S. system, but the thing I would say is in my discussions recently with Israelis, they essentially see a lot of parallels between what's going on. The two divided societies along social, cultural, religious lines, partisan lines, vulnerable in part because of those divisions from external actors and things like this, and leaders that seem unwilling to sort of build broader coalitions or not interested in that at home. And I think, that's the challenge. Is I think Israel itself is deeply divided in many ways that America is, and that holds us back. And what we see right now in Trump and Bibi is an alliance that moves towards something that may produce results in the short run for Israel, more security, things like this, but may limit them and put a ceiling on what they can do with countries like Saudi Arabia and the broader region.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And this has been terrific. I've enjoyed it. I'm sure the audience has enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your time today.
And
I've learned a lot.
I apologize for that. I apologize for that intrusion. We covered a lot of ground. You were an excellent moderator. Check out my work at mei.edu, and please listen to this podcast, Taking the Edge Off the Middle East. I'm trying to change the tone from the more away from the caustic and more just informed and lively and actually friendly discussion about the Middle East.
Well, I definitely will do it, and I bet there'll be many in our audience who do as well. But thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mr. Katulis and Dr. Breck Walker, for this important conversation about what is going on in the Middle East and what might lay ahead under this new administration. The program will be archived and available on tnwac.org. I would like to invite you to become a member and a donor supporting TNWAC to carry out its mission through all programs on global affairs. Thank you all, and goodbye for now.